from the streets of New York City, Porkins Policy Radio. Here's Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can hear this show live every Tuesday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern by tuning into Ocelli.com. Of course, you can also find all of the shows archived on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. If you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can, of course, follow the RSS feed directly. You can subscribe on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM, Podbean. Pretty much all minor and major podcatchers will have the feed. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. If you want to support me and the work that I do, then you can go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond. And for as little as $1 a month, you will get access to the exclusive monthly bonus podcast. And quickly, because we do have a very special guest joining us, and we have a jam-packed episode, but quickly, I just wanted to update all of the listeners out there. You will probably have noticed that I was away the past two Tuesdays. There was no show. If you haven't seen, I put a little audio update. It's on the website. I think I forgot to put it on Patreon, but I will be putting it on Patreon. But little audio update about the hiatus that I'm going to be taking from the show. So if you haven't heard, this week and next week will be the final two shows for a little while I take a bit of a break from Porkins Policy Radio. I will be, of course, continuing to do the monthly bonus podcast, and I will also be doing my regular appearance on the Ocelli Effect. So every other Tuesday from 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern, you can find me on the Ocelli Effect. And the reason that I am taking a break from the radio show is so that I can focus my time and energy on my Epstein book. So I am, people will probably have heard that I am writing a book about Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein, of course. If anybody thought it might be a different Epstein. And anyway, I just needed to take a little bit of time to work on that. So I will be taking a break from the radio show. But as I said, there will still be the monthly bonus podcast. There will still be my regular appearance, guest hosting on the Ocelli Effect. So that will continue to happen, and I think we'll probably throw in some extra episodes here and there. Christoph Gehrman and I were chatting earlier today. We were emailing each other, so we're hoping to do something, but that might be a little bit farther down the line. But there will still be things. But anyway, that is enough about that. You can, of course, go to my website. You can listen to the little audio update that I did, and I'll be kind of this month's bonus podcast will probably be somewhat related to that and some Epstein related news, because there's some interesting stuff happening that for whatever reason the many in the media seem to be sort of focused elsewhere, and including many in the British media that are focused on Brexit. And to discuss Brexit and all things Brexit, Boris Johnson, hopefully we will talk a little bit about Black Rod, the return of Black Rod, fingers crossed. And to help us understand and decipher all this, we are joined by our good friend of the show, Matthew Alford. Matt is, of course, a teaching fellow at the University of Bath. He's the author of several books, including The Writer with No Hands, and his most recent book, which is Union Jackboot: What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About Foreign Policy, which he co-wrote with T.J. Coles. And we had Matt on the show back in February for episode 174 to talk about this. And I think we'll probably we'll end up talking about several of the things that are brought up in Union Jackboot. But Matt Alford, how are you? It's good to have you back on.
Hi, Piers. Nice to be back on the show. I'm doing very well, thanks.
Excellent. Well, as I said, this is going to be a jam-packed episode. We are going to be talking Brexit, hopefully Boris Johnson, and everything that is going on related to that. And I mean, I guess you know what? Actually, I wanted to start with this, Matt, because back in February when you were on talking about Union Jackboot, of course, we ended up talking about Theresa May. who was still in power at that time. And I went back and I was listening to a little bit of it, and because I remembered it, but I wanted to sort of make sure. But I sort of dismissed your prediction that Boris Johnson.
I was going to say, what prediction did I make?
Well, I kept saying there's no way that Boris Johnson would make it, or I couldn't fathom that he would be prime minister. There was something so goofy about him, and I mean, at the time he was Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, and sort of laughable. What he was doing in that capacity. I just couldn't believe it, and I kind of poo-pooed it. And you were actually saying that no, it's entirely likely that he could become the next prime minister. And lo and behold, your predictions were right, Matt. So why don't we just start with that? I mean, what do you make of that? The fact that this guy, who, from an outside perspective here in the U.S., looking over at the UK and politics. I mean, it's funny. I think I know myself. I look at the stuff in Parliament, for instance, with John Bercow, and yelling and as I said, I mean, I'm a little obsessed with this Black Rod character. That was I remember waking up to that in the news, and it seems so like crazy and what's going on, and Boris Johnson seems so wacky. But I think that's like everybody's political system is absolutely bonkers. I'm sure you look over here at the sad state of affairs in the U.S. Congress and probably think the same thing, Matt. But I mean, what do you make of this of Boris Johnson ascending to power?
Well, I mean, I think it speaks to the fact that the quality of the Conservative front bench is not that good, and that those kind of people who have lived that kind of life, often of considerable privilege, people like Michael Gove and Theresa May and so on, find it often quite difficult to connect with the public because they're a bit weird. And Boris Johnson is one of those kind of people because he does come from considerable privilege, Eton educated and so on. But he has got one of those kind of upper middle class twit sort of characters that all of us actually kind of quite like. So in that regard, he bridges the class divide in a way that that people can enjoy, and that's why he can be on TV comedy panel shows like Have I Got News for You, and which is really where he made his real connection with the British public, and initially sort of 10 to 20 years ago, and it's how and why characters like Winston Churchill can be have been in the past very successful, because they're seen to have the kind of common touch. It's the same thing even with David Cameron, the Prime Minister prior to Theresa May. And, he was seen as generally speaking, as someone who was, he was very upper class, but someone who could sort of speak to ordinary people, if you like. We book a comedian sometimes called Magnus Turner MP, who always talks about he's a character act, obviously, but he always talks about I've been going around talking to all of you normal, ordinary, hard-working people, and he's incredibly patronising. But it's all of you ordinary people. I love you all, and. But that is kind of what that kind of patrician way of being is often comes across as very much out of touch. But in Boris's case, he was able to use that as a kind of communication skill. I mean, I've met some very posh people before, and they're actually really often very delightful people. It's just that you wouldn't want them to be running the country,
right?
Because they've got their own set of lunacy and their own weaknesses in terms of responsibility. I mean, Boris Johnson, I'd have thought, would have made a lovely Oxford Don. You know, I can see him teaching around Balliol College or whatever. You know, he would have been good at that, or he would have been good as a kind of ramshackle. He'd probably made a very good homeless person. You know, I'm sure it would have been charming and made plenty of money every day. But and I'm sure he's good to have a beer with. I mean, his family's all over the TV. His dad was on TV this morning, just talking about whether over 70-year-olds should be banned from voting, which was a rather unfair a piece to have on the, but it was a kind of puffer piece. But you know, his dad was on there, his sister was on the comedy panel show a week ago, and so, you know, they're all decent. And his brother and sister, who both resigned from his government a couple of months ago. All of them, you know, they all seem like perfectly decent types, but they're just from a particular sector of society who are, you know, very, very privileged, and that comes with an ability to communicate, but also some real deficiencies in terms of, you know, understanding the way that the world works and understanding what is needed for people in society. I don't think the Conservative Party have got an answer to that.
No, it's my sort of limited knowledge of Boris Johnson. I always think of that he does sort of he comes off as sort of like, you know, avuncular, you know, like you said, sort of like upper class twit, but like he probably would be fun at a party.
Yeah.
You know, he definitely knows where to, like, you know, get the good drugs and stuff like that. And you know, he would probably be a bit of a laugh. But, you know, at the same time, do you want him kind of like, you know, running your country? And it's funny that he is able to, like, appeal to working class people or certainly people that wouldn't, normally have an affinity for the super wealthy. But, you know, at the same time, the one thing that always sort of, that I always sort of turn back to, and maybe you would know the specifics of this, but when he was working, I think when he was writing for the Telegraph and he was making this, he had this exorbitant salary. Didn't he sort of like just sort of flippantly say, "Oh, well, that's like pocket money," and that we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds?
I think he was referring to a £100,000, which is roughly equivalent in dollars these days because the pound's crashed through the floor. But
it's still a lot of money.
It's still a lot of money. He was referring to that. I think he was paid £100,000 for writing a column, which I think was even a weekly column. And he said that, you know, this was, you know, kind of, I can't remember the exact phrase he used, but we mentioned it in Union Jackboot. I think he said it was something like it was chicken feed, or, you know, no one can live on that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You know,
well, he probably couldn't live on that, you know?
Well, he couldn't because he's got a massive property interests, which would need to be maintained. And that's why I guess there are a lot of people who think that Boris Johnson is a really deeply unpleasant and vicious character. I'm not so sure about that. I think he's very much a political climber, and you know, he will stab people in the back. But I don't think that I think he's kind of a sort of classic politician, really. I don't think he's a proper psycho. You know, he's not a sociopath, I don't think. I don't buy into that sort of perspective on his particular character. I think he probably can function in normal society, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like with Donald Trump. I know everyone keeps comparing them, but I think they're kind of right to. You can see a lot of parallels. But like, Donald Trump always strikes me as someone who is a bully who's pretending to be a psychopath in a room full of psychopaths. You know, he's actually not mentally scarred enough to be a total horror show American Psycho type, but he kind of wants to give that impression that he is, because he wants to look tough, and so he's surrounded himself with these complete horrible lunatics. Boris Johnson is, you know, he's I'd say more of someone who has those, you know, he's part of that. He comes from that constituency of extreme wealth and privilege. I don't think that he's I don't think he's a vindictive person. He's just a kind of politician. It's interesting always to look at the way that people have reacted around these guys. It's funny with people like David Cameron, who wrote his autobiography, and it's clear that David Cameron really despised all of the people who are around him. And it's strange that they can't make that leap and think, well, maybe I'm not in the right party here.
Or I don't have to hire those people.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's like how far do those people feel that they have to compromise in order to keep at bay some kind of amorphous threat to their sense of what Britain is. And I mean, what it is that these people like Theresa May will they're so terrified of a change of government, of a Corbyn-led government, that they will compromise. They'll work with the extreme elements of the like the IUC, for example, in Northern Ireland, just to they'll bend over backwards to accommodate them, even though it's very much a homophobic party and all that. But it's because of that kind of, the rationale at least is that the fear that they'll be replaced as a government by socialists, and it's peculiar how terrified people still are of socialists. I mean, I just think that the Labour front bench is really, really good, and I just may as well disclose that. I mean, I think there's anyone who doesn't vote for the Labour Party who's earning less than £1 million in the bank is probably is voting against their own interests. So that's where I stand on it, and people are welcome to disagree. But and I know it's a bit weird not weird. It's kind of, maybe it's not very cool to, as a political analyst or media analyst, to nail my colours to the mast so clearly. But I'd rather just disclose that. It's just obvious that the Labour front bench are, ideologically at least, going to be much better for society. God knows what will actually happen. If the Labour Party does actually get into government, then there might be such a horrible backlash that it creates all sorts of paralysis and unpredictable outcomes. But I think it's got to be worth a go. I've actually forgotten what your question was now, Piers.
No, that's okay. No, that's great, because we'll kind of pick up on what you were saying there about labor in just a moment, but I just wanted to bring it back a little bit, just to again kind of flesh out Boris Johnson, because he's such an interesting character. But you mentioned the comparison with Donald Trump, and I know I've kind of made that comparison, and it seems like everybody now, it sort of uses Donald Trump as some sort of a stand-in. So, I don't know. It was like what's his Duterte in the Philippines. He's the Donald Trump of the Philippines, and Bolsonaro, and there's like a million sort of comparisons. It's interesting. That's interesting in and of itself. But yeah, there does seem to be something there. But I actually think that Boris Johnson tends to, in my view, use his buffoonishness in a way that's a little bit more on the ball than Donald. Like, I think Donald Trump doesn't think of himself as or he is like embarrassed that people think he's a buffoon. He doesn't like that. Yeah. Whereas I think Boris Johnson is total, with like the weird hair and like in some of those interviews, it's like he has to know he's coming off like a total idiot. That the pictures of him, like if you Google Boris Johnson bicycle, there's pictures of him riding a bike. I mean, he has to know he looks like like a sort of inbred upper crust twit. But I think he's more aware of it. And just as like a comparison also, I'm sure you've seen the thick of it, right, Matt?
Yeah.
He kind of reminds me of like Ben Swain. That's sort of like, bumbling doofus, but he's not like a super evil person. Although he can be kind of, rude and crass. That sort of seems to me, well, I think you're right in your spot with it. He's a politician, like pure and simple. That's like always what he was going to be.
Right. I've been kind of, some people do accuse him of being horrible because he has said a few racist things. For example, he compared Muslim women he said that they look like letterboxes, because of the jab, and
it's like a series of racist things.
And he made some really horrible comments about Liverpudlians wallowing in grief because of a tragedy that happened about 30 years ago, where about 90 people were crushed to death in a stadium, and it was kind of it was, at least in significant part, the fault of the authorities, and et cetera, et cetera. So he has said and done some really horrible things, but I think there's a difference between being a really insensitive piece of filth, which I think is probably a fair description of Boris Johnson, and being someone who is actually kind of a calculated, vicious, jackbooted style character. I don't think he's exactly that.
Yeah. Well, let's dive a little bit deeper with all of this, and I guess just let's bring it forward. Where are we right now vis-a-vis Brexit? Because this seems to be, it's something that I have had trouble keeping up with. And I think that part of that is also like just the time difference. Like here, like we'll wake up here and some crazy thing has happened the night before in British Parliament, and it's hard to sort of keep track of all of it. Obviously, the British parliamentary system of government to me seems absolutely insane. And also. I'm still confused exactly about like what's happening with, deal, no deal. They keep extending the deadline. Seemingly it looks like they could just extend it forever. So where are we like right now? Because I think this morning I was reading that there was, even yet another sort of change of date. This time talking about the possibility of an election. So where are we right now, Matt?
Well, let me just point out first of all that when the system seems like it's really weird, because there's so much jeering and hostility and antagonism, in a way, that's because the system is working, because the system is deliberately set up to be adversarial in the House of Commons, so that there is, so that it creates accountability and proper argumentation, and that's actually quite a good thing in a way. I know people look at it and it upsets them because they think that politicians aren't agreeing and they're not sorting anything out. But in a way, that's part of as long as it doesn't persist forever and nothing ever gets done, it's actually quite healthy to have those kind of debates and that kind of because it creates accountability. So,
I wish it was like that here. That is like one of the few things that at least they're like genuine, and there is like a debate. Here you would never have. They would all just go into a closed door meeting. It's like at least in the British Parliament when they're screaming at each other, it's like where these people stand. Whereas here they would all be sort of lockstep. They might trade barbs, like on different media outlets, but they would never sort of argue like that. I actually find that quite refreshing.
Yeah, of course, it can be harmful as well, and it has created a certain toxicity and entrenchment of views here, which has paralysed Parliament. But nevertheless, as a kind of general thing, when the man on the street says, "Oh, they never seem to get anything done. They should just all, just all be working together." Well, if you really genuinely want that, you've just destroyed one of the great systems of parliamentary democracy, and in fact you're creating a kind of fascistic state, because as long we have a government of national unity, everyone agrees, ignore the other side of the argument, just push through whatever. I think it's as a general instinct we should be happy when we see this kind of level of debate. And it may not seem like that way at the moment, but it's basically a good thing. Anyway, to your main point, to your main query, what's happening now? Well, on Halloween, which is in 2 days' time, we were due to leave the European Union, come what may, and there was a real risk for quite some time that we might leave without a deal, which would be this unprecedented thing where a whole huge country, Great Britain, would leave a massive trade bloc and a political organisation with no rules and no plan. Fortunately, that has not happened, and it seems impossible for that to happen. And in fact, the possibility of Britain leaving without any kind of arrangement at any point now now seems almost impossible to happen. It still might happen if something goes horrendously wrong, but it seems very unlikely to happen. So the most sort of nightmarish disaster of no arrangements at all between Britain and the European Union has definitely receded to the point of almost not having. But the European Union has instead given us another 3 months to decide what's happening. And I think that's because they can see that, they've got a provisional deal with Boris Johnson, which is basically having certain economic ties between the continent and Britain, and basically things continuing vaguely as normal, not completely disastrous, sort of customs union type arrangements. And also because they can see that that there's going to be a general election, and they know that Britain needs to have time to therefore hold that general election and sort it out. It's literally been today that there's been motions in Parliament, which I'm literally watching on TV now on silent whilst we talk, and it looks like there's going to be a general election in mid-December. They're currently debating the general election bill, so and they're trying to determine exactly what date that will be on, but it looks like it will be December the 9th. But there's some debate as to exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah,
and there's going to be a general election, which is the first time in nearly 100 years that there's been a general election in December. You can only imagine how odd that's going to be, because, I mean, do you know what Britain's like in December? It gets pitch black at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Or maybe
it's cold.
Maybe slightly late. It's cold. It's going to be wet. It's going to be horrible. And it's going to be peculiar because, of course, the Labour Party thrive on big turnouts to polling booths, because you tend to get your older people come out for the Conservatives. So they might not have a big turnout because it might well be really freezing cold, and people are going to be preoccupied with Christmas and other things like that. But at the same time, if you're an 86-year-old guy who really wants to support the Conservative Party and Brexit, do you really want to be going out at 2 degrees, to cast your vote? I don't know. So I think it could lead to very unpredictable results. Will old people turn out if it's freezing? Will young people turn out if it's freezing?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, Corbyn just was on, the leader of the Labour Party was on TV a couple of hours ago, sort of making a sort of weak joke, actually probably highlighting their major concern, which is he said, "I've just had a weather forecast and it's going to be really good." Corbyn's, as much as I love Jeremy Corbyn, he is not a very good rabble rouser or or speaker or joker. but that's the point, is that the Labour Party are saying, God, this could be horrendous, because is anyone going to turn out and vote when they're miserable in the middle of December? Jeez, really?
And there's no way around getting around that, right? Like, it would just have to be like, they couldn't push it up and do November or something like that, right?
No, I mean, it would be too soon anyway to arrange an election, because remember, it's the 29th of October now. So it takes about 6 weeks to arrange one at minimum, as I understand. Right. I think it's the same thing with the referendum. I mean, what really should have happened here, in my view, which is the accurate and rational view, as we all know, is that there should have been a second referendum, because then that would have been a good thing to have happened first, because that would have clarified the position of the country as to whether we actually want to continue anyway with this Brexit process 3.5 years on, with the whole nation having been through a sort of intensive civics lesson, and I suspect that the result of that could well be to remain in the European Union anyway. But the Conservative government obviously hasn't wanted to do that, because it would further tear them apart. So instead, it is the Conservatives have pushed for an election, and the Labour Party have accepted that as their own least worst option.
But and just so that we're clear on this, the general election, this will be across the board. This is parliamentary elections. This could decide if Jeremy Corbyn becomes the prime minister, and in fact, Boris Johnson could theoretically not stay on as prime minister, right? Someone could challenge him.
Okay. So a few things here. First of all, it's almost certain that a general election is going to happen. But as with everything at the moment, there is a slight possibility that it might, even that might fall through. So, for example, some people in the House of Commons are trying to push forward an idea that's been around for a long time, that 16 and 17-year-olds should have the right to vote. And I think if that happens, Boris Johnson will just pull, if that is successful somehow, then Boris Johnson will pull the idea anyway, because obviously everyone who's 16 and 17 will vote for a Remain party, and the Labour Party is as close to being a kind of rational Remain party, as that might be a good way of putting it, as you can get. The Labour Party position is basically, we'll have a second referendum and will allow there to be a public vote again, and we'll negotiate a deal with the European Union, and if you like that, then good, and if not, you can vote for Remain, or we'll just keep it as before, which seems like a much less chaotic way of doing things than the Conservatives are doing. But anyway, so it looks like there's going to be a general election. But it's not 100% guaranteed, and we probably won't know for another day or so until that's certain. Now, what was the other question?
Well, so a general election, Boris Johnson could conceivably lose that also, right? I mean, or he could.
Well, so here's what could happen. So, I mean, it's good. I think in the great scheme of things, there needs to be something to break the impasse, and the general election is the thing that can do that. A second referendum could also have done it, and would have done it perhaps a bit more fairly and a bit more appropriately, but that could well come anyway if the Labour get in. But yeah, there's two results to the general election that is possible, and it looks like we're going to know these well before Christmas. Two results are: one, Boris Johnson wins. Now, this is the most likely of all outcomes, according to all data that everybody has. So the latest opinion polls, including the poll of polls, like the aggregated results, suggest that the Conservative Party are on 36% and that the Labour Party are on 24%. Now, for a government that has been mired in so much scandal and chaos and everything, these figures are absolutely dreadful for the Labour Party. And if Boris Johnson wins and gets a majority in the House of Commons, and then Jeremy Corbyn is going to be out within minutes of that election result being called. The entire geography of this entire landscape of British politics will change if the Conservatives win a majority, because they will then be able to push through their deal through the House of Commons. Brexit will happen. And we'll have a pretty solid Conservative Party rule in this nation, which I think would be really awful. But, at least it would break that impasse, one might say. At least it will stop that, the kind of this never-ending
back and forth. I mean, it's
back and forth in Parliament, where I have to come on podcast shows right. Trying to explain what the hell is going on with various lords and ladies and black rods and everything like that. I mean, I've never been asked to talk about British politics, let alone European politics, before until this year. But I've had many invitations to do so on podcasts, because it's kind of captured the world's imagination. That's a very nice way of putting it. I think it's just
but it has
made a lot of people tear their hair out around the world, and So resort to people like me to try to explain what the hell's going on.
Oh, I've been at work multiple times the past couple of months where people at work are arguing about Brexit. And it's like, we don't even live in that country, I mean, we've got our own problems here, obviously. I mean, it's like talk about back and forth, endless, impeachment hearings and all this other stuff. But, it has captured the imagination. People are like deeply fascinated. It's every morning on the radio, there is at least a 2 or 3 minute segment on Brexit. What is happening? Who's up, who's down? General election vote, and they push back the deadline. So it has totally captured the imagination. But I'll get back to you, Matt. Explain what. So leaving aside the possibility of Boris Johnson winning. What's the other outcome of a general election?
The other outcome is that the Labour Party win, and under those circumstances, they would offer. Well, first of all, the Labour Party, the new Labour leader, first of all, let me just go back to one other thing you said, which is that could they change Boris Johnson as a leader? That's not going to happen in an election race. No one's going to be. Neither of the two leaders are going to be changed in an election race. It would just be too weird and a sign of weakness for that to happen. So even the people who hate Jeremy Corbyn are not going to try and change Corbyn during in the next 6 weeks. But
what I meant is that they could win the election and then not choose like Boris Johnson to be prime minister, right? Is that my understanding? Like they could essentially elect a different prime minister.
What if Boris Johnson gets into wins a general election?
Can that happen?
I don't think there would ever be a precedent for that because if a prime minister has won and has just conducted a successful election campaign,
why would you challenge him?
Why would you change it? They're going to be lording it over everybody, and it's going to be this is a massive success. So why would you get? I mean, I suppose there must be some kind of possibility of that sometimes happening if the prime minister knows that they've got some kind of horrendous scandal that they're trying to keep quiet or that they're ill or something like that. That I'm sure there have been those sort of things that have happened, but no, the natural logical dynamic of that trajectory of that would be for Boris Johnson to be an extremely popular and powerful prime minister, the man who delivered Brexit. The man who saw off the socialist threat from Jeremy Corbyn, the sort of Churchillian figure. You saw him as a kind of a figure of fun or a bit of a fool, but actually he's the one who's got all this done. He's the new dynamic voice and dynamic face of the new Britain, thundering into the 21st century. As of course, that will be the way that it's presented. The alternative is that the Labour Party win. And the odds are severely stacked against that. I sincerely hope that it does happen, but the Labour Party were, at the last election, 20 points adrift in the opinion polls at one point, and that was only about 9 or 10 weeks prior to the election in 2017, and this was with Corbyn as leader. So everyone had written off the Labour Party in the 2017 election, but actually they gained seats. I think they gained about 9 seats, and the Conservative Party lost over a dozen seats. So it was seen as a great triumph for Corbyn back in 2017, and I have some hope, but it's a pretty forlorn hope, particularly in the middle of bloody December. But I have some hope that perhaps Corbyn can repeat that success from 2017 and maybe form a government, or maybe there'll be a hung parliament, and but that he'll be able to be the leader somehow. And under those circumstances, the Labour Party will do what should have happened a year ago or even 2 years ago, which is put the issue back to the people and say, look, hang on a sec, let's just confirm now, because it's been quite a long time since this 2016 referendum. do the people actually want to have this deal with the European Union, which will be really similar to the Boris Johnson deal anyway, but with a few more workers' rights protections, environmental rights protections. It'll be a bit different with the customs union in Northern Ireland, but it's all kind of, generally speaking, it'll be a similar kind of thing. Or do the people want to just change their mind entirely and remain in the European Union? I suspect what you'll find, if the Labour Party get in and the Labour Party are campaigning for Remain, or at least campaigning with a nod and a wink for Remain, because they might be in a rather difficult position at that point, I suspect that you'll find that you'll have an enormous turnout from young people in this country, and it will have a brilliant effect, which will lead to at least 50%, probably whatever, say 55% of the population voting to Remain. And it'll be very hard then for that 2016 referendum to count for much. And there will be people who gripe about that, and I'm sure that there'll be protests on the streets and so on. But I think it would be actually rather definitive if that is the sequence of events. Corbyn, general election, Corbyn Prime Minister, second referendum, Remain wins. I think it would be a really great thing for this country. Huge youth turnout. It would be a revolution in a way.
It seems, just to play devil's advocate there, Matt. And I would, I guess if we're laying out the cards on the table, I would, if I were British, I would most likely, vote to Remain. But just to play devil's advocate, I mean, the second referendum, I mean, is that, fair to all of those people that voted the first time, or is that just, it seems silly, in a way, it's like, let's have a vote again to see if that vote was really what people wanted. But, is that fair, to all those people that, all those hardworking Brexiters that, worked, the first time around?
I think that I do get that point, and that is you're making the argument from the right, which is that that they will say, well, how many times do you want to have this referendum?
Right.
You just want to have it again and again and again until you get the result that you want. I do get that. If that had happened a week after the vote in summer of 2016, if all of the Remainers said, maybe we should do that again, that would be very different. But, we're talking, this is 3.5 years on. The whole country is changing. You're going to have several tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people who have voted Brexit who are going to drop down dead from old age.
Right.
For a start, you've got another few tens of thousands of people who have just come into the electoral pool because they will have turned 18. So maybe hundreds of thousands is an exaggeration for people dropping off, but it will be in the
a significant amount of people are going to be gone.
Amount of people, and you've also got a huge change in terms of we've had 3.5 years of new information about what the Brexit deal is, about what the what the nature of Europe is. So much has changed in terms of what people know and understand. And that's not to say necessarily that people were ignorant or wrong or anything like that the first time, but some people will have been. And even if they weren't, why not just have a confirmatory vote? And the thing is, in fact, rarely get me to say this, but occasionally Tony Blair does say things, even if he does come from, straight from a barrel of snake oil. He did say about 6 months ago, he said, well, look, people like me would be very happy to have this second vote, have a second referendum, and for it to be binding, so that even if our side lose, even if we say, okay, we're going to go for this ridiculous or weak, poor quality deal with Europe, just so that we can say that we've done Brexit on paper, if the people vote for that, even 51%, okay, fine, let's do it. Let's just go ahead. At least we'll know.
Right.
But as it is, the opinion polls are suggesting that that if there was a second poll now, Remain would win it really rather easily. So I don't know. I don't really. But I think I suppose for me, I'd be interested to know with you as a rational person, particularly someone from the outside of United Kingdom, if you seriously believe that argument, because I think that it's kind of a crazy argument, but maybe I've just got a bit too close to this thing.
No, I don't disagree with you. I think that you're right that it's not a crazy thing to ask for a second one, and I think you're right too that it's as harsh as it might be to have the second referendum be binding, that no matter what happens, that's the end of it. I think that it would certainly suck, for all of those people that want to remain. Certainly. Again, as an outsider looking in on it, there's a lot of things that I didn't know that seem to have been tucked away in this deal that are coming to light now. So, just imagine, people there are how they're feeling, where it's really going to be affecting them. But I think you're right. At some point, you kind of, you got to shit or get off the pot. Either you're going to do this or you're not. And the endless, I think we'll discuss this a bit more in the second hour, but this endless back and forth is certainly distracting us from a lot of other things that are going on, both around the world, but also I'm sure domestically in the UK that are affecting people. So you can have this sort of back and forth argument, and seemingly this could go on forever. That's how it seems to me. And you've got the extension to January 31st. It's like every time there's another extension, they just prove that this can be extended forever. I don't think the EU. It seems to me that the EU is perfectly comfortable with extending this over and over again. Until they get whatever the best deal is for them. What do they don't have anything to lose. Obviously there are economic incentives for the United Kingdom to stay in the EU, but I think the EU has a lot less to lose. And of course, that's why I'm sure, Matt, many people are now, beginning to kind of wake up to this, that the leaving the European Union is sort of like a net negative. They're losing more out of this than they're actually gaining. The big one, which I don't know how I don't know how they were able to sell this as, no, it's all going to be okay, is of course the border with Ireland. This seems to be like completely, I know this just is like a firsthand experience. When I was in Ireland last year in March visiting family, that's all they were talking about. The progress that had been made, and again too, speaking as I'm half Irish, and obviously I speaking with my relatives there. They said that the sort of peace in Northern Ireland is tenuous at best, and that this could really actually unravel a lot of this. And I don't want to go to a worst case scenario, but I don't. A lot of those tensions are still kind of boiling. And that they're it's better now than it ever has been. Obviously, there's not like a low intensity conflict going on, but that's not to say that it couldn't happen again. And I think that it's oddly, that Brexit has strained that sort of those tensions even more. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Matt, because that seems to be one of the big ones, where it is like maybe there should be a second referendum because are we actually sure we want to go back to a hard border? And that one seems kind of like, how do you get around that? And I don't know how they sold that to people that, it'll all be okay.
Yeah. Well, obviously, political, political architecture is often very fragile, and, small changes can have very big effects. Obviously, I think that remaining in the European Union is a good idea, and I think that a Labour government is a good idea. So, if I was in control of this, then we would not be having these kind of problems. I don't think that we should. I don't think that having a hard border in Northern Ireland is a good idea, but then nobody does, including Boris Johnson, including the entirety of the Conservative Party. No one wants to have a hard border, but and the way that they tried to fudge this and compromise it was to say that there's not going to be a border, but there'll be kind of other forms of checks on goods, which will involve checkpoints a few miles away from the main border, and there'll be use of electronic tagging on goods and things like that, so that there is a much reduced military presence. But it's all kind of dancing around on the head of a pin, because in the end it's still creating. So there's still got to be a border there at some point, whether it's down the Irish Sea or across between Ireland and Northern Ireland. There's going to be some kind of border, and that is going to be unacceptable. Just as it was when the RUC voted against Boris Johnson only a week or so ago, even though Boris Johnson seemed to have fudged a kind of arrangement with the EU that everyone could kind of get behind, but even then it wasn't sufficient for the RUC. So I'm not quite sure what to say about that. I mean, obviously, no one wants to return to the troubles of Northern Ireland, is even that a rather unfair thing to say that it's the Northern Ireland troubles? It was the troubles that created by Britain, the British troubles.
Yeah, right. They were certainly their troubles. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we were all troubled by it. I mean, right. Particularly the 3,000 people who were killed by it between I think it was the late 60s and mid 1990s. So, yeah, obviously no one wants that to happen, and one hopes that there's a way to deal with that. I don't know. I kind of feel that the people who should answer that question are the Irish people, rather than me, who's had less direct experience of that. And one can only hope that it works out. But the best way for it to work out is to not leave the European Union. Mm.
No, I think you're so spot on there too with talking about political architecture, because I mean you see that in all sorts of where these sort of tenuous peace deals. Certainly, I mean that was the case in a lot of places, like in Central Africa. You can see how the tiniest thing can sort of unravel peace, say in Congo certainly, but also in other places, Uganda, Sudan. You see that in Yemen now, all the time. And I mean, again, it's something as seemingly innocuous as changing the border could have a profound effect. And it's funny, just on that, I saw he is just so unpleasant. Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think that's his, and I saw some video of him talking about, it won't be a big deal. We'll just go back to checkpoints, how it was, in the good old 70s and 80s, and nobody's really going to mind, and it's all okay. And he's talking about, the country being under siege, and checkpoints, even if what he's saying is that, it'll just be simple little checkpoints. I mean, for a lot of people, those checkpoints were not simple. People get dragged out of cars and interrogated, and it just those sort of simmering, animosity towards in different groups there, and the fact that it is all coming to bubble over this vote to remain in the European Union, I mean, is just sort of proof positive of what you were saying, the tenuous nature of political architecture. And
I mean, this is the thing about that. I've found over the last few months, I tend to sleep. I can only sleep these days with the TV on all night. It's really annoying. I never used to have this problem, but I have to have the telly on, and I woke up having subliminally watched over 4 hours of the Conservative Party conference a few weeks ago, which was I actually woke up listening to someone talking about how great Brexit was, and I realised that it was, and then he started talking about this book that he'd written, in the 90s, and how it began. He tried to write the first page, but all he got through was he wrote two letters, which was the words F-U. And I realised that it was bloody Michael Dobbs, the guy who wrote
House of Cards.
He wrote House of Cards. And he was on TV at 4 o'clock in the morning doing this rabble-rousing speech to the Conservative Party, supporting Brexit and supporting Boris Johnson. But then doing this bit of a chat about having invented Francis Underwood and what's he called in America?
Francis Urquhart.
Francis Urquhart and in Britain. And what was the character called in the States?
I think it was Underwood. Frank Underwood, though.
Frank
yeah.
Underwood. Anyway, but also as part of that discussion, because it became a round-table discussion, there were some other leading Conservatives on as part of that chat that I was sort of half watching at this point at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they were talking about the popularity of the Conservative Party and its appeal. And one of the people, and I'm sorry I can't remember who it was, but one of the people there, quite innocently and sort of nicely, said, I think that actually we could really appeal to maybe even half the country. And that is what the fundamental thing is there, of the people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and all of that. They're thinking purely in terms of appeal, only really at the most, said by the nicest kind of person on stage, they think that it's important to look after the interests of half of the people of the country, and they don't care about the rest. So that's my inference that I draw from it. And actually, we all know, really, if we look into it, that the idea of the Conservative Party appealing to or looking after the interests of even half the people is a laughable extension. What's the word when you extrapolation from the graph? Because really they're looking after they're only really benefiting a very small percentage or even a fraction of a percentage of the people in society, depending on exactly how you look at it and all that. But
half of the UK isn't rich enough for them to care.
Yeah, well, half of Britain is not their constituency because they're never going to vote for them. So there's no point, there's no point in doing anything for them. And this was just a nice guy on stage, just sort of blithely talking as part of a bit of a chat. It wasn't some crazy ideologue or tub thumper for free market economics. It was that was just a standard thing. No one reacted in the crowd. Of course you wouldn't. But if the Labour Party said, well, we could do something good for maybe half the country, that would be that would seem peculiar. It would be a sort of terrible thing to say, because they're meant to be a movement that is benefiting. It's almost like the Labour Party is expected to try to benefit all of society, and when any one human being loses out in that situation, it's like, oh well, look, they can't make everything good for everyone.
Right, yeah.
When the Conservatives do it, it's like, oh yeah, of course they're like that. That's what their aim is. They don't care about checkpoints. Well, why should they? Not going to.
Well, they're not going to be bothered. I don't think Jacob Rees-Mogg is going to have to worry about a checkpoint. He's probably never going to set foot in Northern Ireland, unless he absolutely has to. And it's just what you were saying there too. I mean, it's like you said, if Labour fails in any particular way, or any one person, certainly here, that's it. You see, socialism is always a failure. Don't ever think about don't ever try to implement socialism. Don't even try to think about implementing any aspect of it. We see that
exactly. I mean, it gets to the stage where holding Labour up to account. It's does the leader of the Labour Party did he bow to the cenotaph at the War Memorial commemoration at a significant enough angle? And he's failed by 2 degrees of an angle to bow enough his head to the war dead. That was in the Sun newspaper, where they literally had a diagram of Jeremy Corbyn's head to see how much of an angle, using a protractor, to see how much of an angle he bowed at on November the 11th of 2017, 2018. And any kind of failure, any step wrong, the media will attack. But I guess it's across society as well. That kind of thing. It's like, well, if you're holding yourself up to be a party that is a party of the people, where you're trying to look after everyone, it's almost like, well, you screw you then. If you fail in that regard, then if you fail at all in that regard, then we'll come down on you like a ton of bricks. That's almost like human nature, where if the Conservatives just say, well, we're only looking after this group of people, then we can all be like, oh, well, they've been really successful in that regard.
and again, that is like that here as well. We see that all the time. But we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we are going to return in the second hour with our good friend Matthew Alford. Matthew is, of course, the teaching fellow at the University of Bath, and he's the author of several books, including Union Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy, which he co-wrote with TJ Coles. We'll be right back after a quick commercial break.
And then there'll be some breaking news.
Straight out of the subway in New York City. Yeah, baby. The radio show that never sleeps. Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
News, entertainment, and more. You will learn something, children's. Ocelli.com.
Uncle, somebody told me the other day that martial law is coming. We're going to get thrown into FEMA camps. Should I be scared or not?
No.
It might be true. Could be.
Could be, but I don't think so.
I'll bet I know who would know. Somebody who does a show on the Ocelli.com radio network.
Somebody will know. Charlie.com would know. He will know.
Better listen to it.
Better listen to him. And he knows what he's talking about.
Ocelli.com.
Ocelli.com.
A reminder that this is the voice of America broadcasting worldwide.
The age of transitions.
Warning, warning, warning. Uncle, the podcast.
The Ocelli Effect.
Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
On Ocelli.com.
Now back to the man, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redmond. If you are joining us here in the second hour, we are talking with our good friend, Matthew Alford. Matt is, of course, a teaching fellow at the University of Bath. He's the author of several books. His most recent book, Union Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy, was co-written with TJ Coles. And if listeners want to hear more about that, we're going to be discussing that a bit here in the second hour, but you can go back to episode 174, and we did, I think, a full 2 hours, Matt and I, talking about Union Jackboot. Tremendously good book. I highly recommend it. There's some really great chapters on Brexit and Boris Johnson, and Nigel Farage is mentioned, and sort of what went on there. And that was actually probably the one of the best resources for me learning about Brexit and about the vote. But just before we went to commercial there, Matt, you said we had a little bit of breaking news. So why don't we kick off the second hour with the breaking news. What is going on right now in the House of Commons?
Well, it looks like, and I'm just trying to make sense of watching live parliamentary television with the sound down, so I don't interfere, so I don't get any feedback on your microphone. But it looks like that the election has been confirmed for December the 12th, and that they've voted on that. But I'm just watching it now. I'm slightly confused because they're putting up slightly contradictory news ticker tape. But I think that's right, that it's confirmed for the 12th of December. I'll let you know if there's any change on that. It's one of these frustrating things where MPs are voting. Looks like there's going to be a general election on December the 12th, but the result of this vote was meant to be at 8 o'clock, just when we went off for commercial. But now the result is going to be confirmed at 20 past 8. So I'll let you know in about 10 minutes.
It's great. It really is like, it's like you think you have something, and then it's just like pushed. The goalposts get pushed back.
I'm sure that they put up the ticker tape there saying confirmed general election date 12th of December, and now they're saying result expected at 2020. It reminds me of the although it was had even more significant consequences, the 2000 election in the USA.
No, exactly. It's just like, well, now hold on.
Called for Al Gore, and it's all, right. Democrats in.
Truly fascinating. Just quickly while we're on British Parliament, will John Bercow, is it true that he's like resigning? He's the Speaker of Parliament, right? Yeah. I think he's standing down. Okay.
So I think that will happen. That will come into effect in a few weeks. I guess that he'll go through until just after the election into the new year.
What do you make of him?
Well, I mean, sort of politically, I guess in a way he's on my side, in that he's someone who has been rather who is a Remain politician who has said that he will do what he can to help the Remain position. And in a way, he should be more neutral than that, because he's meant to be the Speaker of the House, and he's sort of like the umpire of Parliament. So it might be that he's been a little bit unfair there in favour of Remain. Personally, I like him. I can see. I'm favourable to Remain, so I'm a bit biased in that regard. But I do think that he strikes me as someone who has generally been a vocal, clear, articulate person following parliamentary procedure. And what more can you expect really from someone in their job? He seems to be. Did you have any particular impression of him?
Well, I guess I love just the order. The way he pronounces order is great, and some of his I guess quips about some of the other members of Parliament are fantastic. I mean, when he's like putting you down, I mean it almost sounds like something that Armando Iannucci would write. It's
yes,
like it's just wonderful, like a grasp of language, and like I said, I mean, when he's making fun of you, or putting you in your place, I mean, he really means it, and he's able to do it in a way that he's not just shouting and yelling. I mean, he's quite clever, I guess, and intellectual in his put down. So from that perspective, I love it, and. There is something just sort of wonderful about watching him with his robe, yelling and whatnot. I mean, I guess I don't know. I mean, I guess from an outside perspective, I do kind of get that sense that he's maybe slightly too political for the position that he's actually in.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I don't know, that from an outsider looking in, or just sort of thinking in general, I think that's actually a little dangerous. I think we're seeing more and more of that, certainly here in the U.S., where it seems that like your political affiliation is almost like That's how everyone is defining themselves now. We're seeing that more, especially in positions like in the judicial system. That's worrying. The level to which it's just sort of like if you ever voted Democrat in your life and you're a judge or a federal prosecutor, you can't be trusted. Because you're going after Trump. So like the sort of like politicization of everything, that's a little worrying. But just from an entertainment perspective, I love John Bercow. He's just great. And like I said, Black Rod also is probably my second favorite. In terms of
he's got a funny name.
yeah. Well, and the outfit too.
I guess I think I'm a bit more sort of sanguine about the politicization of people and polarization than a lot of people, because, like I said, it's an adversarial system. It's designed like that, and people are in politics to be political and to have affiliations and stuff. I mean, it can lead to bad results, but in the end, squabbling and things is not necessarily a bad thing, and squabbling in public might actually be a good thing for politics. So I'm not too worried about it. As for John Bercow being a kind of entertaining, a sort of politicized but entertaining figure, I guess he's like, if you imagine, it's probably like how I would see Donald Trump if the United States was 100 times less powerful as a state. It would just be like, this is actually quite funny to see this guy acting like this, and it's kind of inconsequential, and it's all right. If Donald Trump didn't have,
his finger on the button,
his finger on the button, literally, or hopefully not quite literally, hopefully a few meters away from the button, then it wouldn't really matter that much that you've got a twit or or even a kind of a bully as a leader. We laugh at Kim Jong-un, because that country is so weak, really. So it seems kind of funny in the same way that, I don't know, you see kind of where I'm going with that. Like,
yeah.
The danger really is power, right? Real power behind a state. That's when the politicization of people and people's own instability is really worrying. When you've got Nixon being 3 or 4 pints down, whatever you measure it in 3 or 4 measures of whiskey down, and is talking about the nuclear football with Henry Kissinger in 1973 with the Arab-Israeli crisis. That's when it's really worrying and really serious. But just because John Bercow holds a political position and is kind of entertaining with that, I'm still inclined to focus on the amusement value of it rather than on the dangers of it.
No, it's kind of. I was watching on Sunday morning the Donald Trump's press conference about the assassination of Baghdadi, and it was one of. It was one of those things where it was like, oh man, if this guy wasn't a complete, like you said, I mean, if he wasn't finger on the button, this would almost be kind of funny listening to him, obviously telling a complete, just load of BS. I mean, like, I don't really believe that they even got Baghdadi necessarily. Or that he was even, this figure that they built him up to be. I mean, something obviously went down there, but, it's just like, he's obviously full of it. In half the things he says, I mean, the tunnel and blowing himself up and whimpering like a dog, and it's like, if he wasn't the leader of the United States, this would be kind of like funny. Like, that almost seemed like a scene out of Veep or The Thick of It. Like stream of consciousness, like diarrhea speech about, killing some inconsequential terrorist.
It's a very memorable speech there, wasn't it?
No, I know. The whole, like, when he, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, like, I kept saying that over and over in my head.
The way he speaks is kind of gorgeous in a way. He's like a beautiful actor, a beautiful performer, Donald Trump. And
that's why he had a great reality show. It's like he is good at that. I will say and then we'll get back to the UK and politics, but there is something also amazing about I despise Donald Trump and really just truly loathe him as an individual and as a politician and stuff. But there is something, and when he is just sort of off script, it's so, and I hate this term, but like cringeworthy to listening to him. But there is something amazing about the fact that he goes up there to give what should have been a prepared, statement, like Obama did when he killed bin Laden, and then walk off. And instead he's like, all right, like, does anybody want to shoot the shit with me? Like, who has a question? And then he's just kind of like, when he's leaning on the side of the podium and he's just like in his element. I mean, there's something amazing about that. And you do get these like, you see him for who he really is, which is probably the most terrifying part. But there's something about that that's just amazing. That a politician would do that, would let them open themselves up for that. And obviously, I mean, half the stuff he said, the Pentagon is now trying to walk back some of these, ludicrous statements.
I noticed. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like with Donald Trump. I mean, if he gets through 4 years, or even let alone 8 years, and doesn't start a third world war, and then and on top of that, if he even did one or two nice things, we might even look back on that as historians of the time and admire his way of doing things more than worrying about the policies. Do you know what I mean? That sort of looking at the surface of what he's done might actually might be a good a sufficient distraction for historians of the future.
Right, that's if he doesn't start World War III.
If he doesn't start World War III.
Sometimes,
and if he did maybe do one or two half decent things.
Right, yeah.
I'm not sure if he has done any. Well, he has done. I think possibly his legacy in terms of foreign policy might come down to things like Syria and Iran and North Korea. And North Korea may go very well, and Iran rather more hangs in the balance, doesn't it? But
and so does Syria too, with moving tanks in to protect the oil, as if it's even ours. I mean,
yeah. And then there's the whole thing with Venezuela, which just seems, I don't know. I mean, that's what the sort of slither of hope that we all had, I think, back in 2016 was that perhaps Donald Trump, by getting in, might actually pull back from some of these worst excesses of American foreign policy. And but one of the things we highlighted did we talk about the piece that I co-wrote about Western media. I don't think we did, because I think it only came out sort of late this summer.
I don't know if we did. No.
So I mean, this is a bit of a segue into what you were talking about, the things that are being ignored. While Brexit is going on as this big distraction, but it also links with what Trump was doing. So, one of the things we were looking at is media coverage of Venezuela, and it was interesting to note that there was this official report written by physicians which said that Trump's sanctions against Venezuela. Simply between 2017 and 2018, I think it was only a 12-month period, had killed 40,000 people. And they try and, there's attempts to distract from that, saying, oh, well, it's because the socialists are running the economy and they've made a complete mess of it, so it leads to people dying. But no. The report is very careful on this to say that this is specifically the result of Trump's sanctions. And of course, Britain in this regard could help as well, because there are various things we could do with loans that would have ameliorated this situation. But it specifically is about people in Venezuela not receiving things like dialysis machines and HIV medication because the American government won't allow it to be imported. So that's why if you've got HIV, you're going to die. And if you need dialysis, you're going to die. And that is a real shame. Sorry, obviously that's a shame. I don't mean it flippantly there. What I mean is that there was this sliver of hope that perhaps Donald Trump would, as brutish as he was, perhaps there would be this kind of fist-bumping sort of narrow calculation that he could actually be more popular, more successful, and waste less time and waste less of America's money by just pursuing kind of rampant economic principles throughout the world and not imposing sanctions on loads of countries for no apparent reason. That he wants to find deals with certain nations. That he wants to be more cooperative with Russia, for example, in a good way. There was that hope, and there are signs of that because it does seem that maybe that could happen with North Korea. And there are signs, and perhaps if Hillary Clinton had got into power, we could have ended up at war in Ukraine or at war in Syria. Certainly seems to be what her advisors were saying. So maybe there has been some good thing there. But the case of Venezuela really holds a particularly bad taste in my mouth about it because it's so unnecessary. There's so little rationale. It's such a bully boy move to do that to that nation that it's kind of disgusting. Well, I mean, it is disgusting. It's just so clear.
It's petty. It's
exactly. It's like the embodiment of who Donald Trump really is. That kind of
absolutely.
Bully. It's sort of he just doesn't like them because they're socialists, and so it's like Russia. Whereas with Kim Jong-un, it's like, well, I can kind of get on by with this guy because he's a kind of bullying, murderous asshole as well.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
It's like Trump's psychodrama is being played out on the world stage, and that's part of it. I don't know. There's still some good things that could happen from those slightly more isolationist tendencies from Trump, but they're playing out in terms of whether they're playing out well or not. That's a pretty uneven ride right now. I mean, I'm not sure if he really. So, for example, there was a couple of weeks ago when he pulled troops out of Syria. That was. I mean, I don't know because I've not followed that as closely as I often do with foreign policy issues, but it just seemed like one of those unnecessary, symbolic Donald Trump style maneuvers where it was like, there were like 50 people or like 100, 50 to 100 American advisors in there, and it was creating some kind of stability there. It wasn't a big deployment, and it's not really doing anyone any good for you to pull them back, except for that you can say, oh yeah, I'm pulling troops back, like I said I would. It's like, well, is that really a great thing to do here? And actually if you look at the what people like Noam Chomsky have said before, and that kind of peace movement, a lot of people in the peace movement don't actually say, oh yeah, just immediately withdraw all American troops from all bases everywhere, immediate. No one really thinks that if they're serious about conflict resolution. There are occasions where small contingents of Western deployment and Western firepower can be useful. It's just, how are you going to use that? And it seemed that probably was one of those instances where a little bit of an American presence was preventing there from being a particularly kind of disruptive and chaotic situation there. Obviously there are quite possibly a lot of worse things going on in the world at the same time. So I'm not saying that's the only thing that we should be focusing on, but it seems like one of those things where it's Trump yet again being sort of style over substance.
No, I completely agree, and I almost, I know that there's this narrative out there that on people in the alternative media, and a lot of people, I don't know why, like on the left, that write about geopolitics and stuff, that seem to think that Donald Trump is really sincere when he talks of, getting the troops out and these sort of isolationist policies, and of course, they're constantly reassessing that every time he goes back on it. Now, there's this narrative out there that, you see, this is the deep state is pulling the strings, and Trump can't, he can't stand, he does something, and then the Pentagon and whatnot reverses it, and it's like, okay, maybe that is true, And I'm even willing to accept that. But then, I mean, why doesn't he go out and say that? You know, I mean, why doesn't he stand up to the the Pentagon and all these other? I mean, he's unwilling to do that. And also, I don't really buy it. I think he wanted to get out of Syria, and then 20 minutes later, he decided that he wanted to stay there. And that's really there's nothing profound or deep about any of the decisions he makes. They really are just whatever someone told him last is what he goes with. And it's just like if all that stuff is true and he's being manipulated, I mean, then who cares? And it's sort of like, are those 40,000 people that have died in Venezuela directly because of his actions? Is that worth it? Because maybe he'll leave Syria. It's just like, are those 40,000 people worth it? For whatever, how the mental gymnastics you want to go through to think of Donald Trump as some sort of like peace president and, anti-interventionist. And the Venezuela one is just such a perfect example where it's like clear, even if he wants to leave these conflicts, he's still willing to, escalate things other places. Venezuela is a good example. Another one that, of course, always flies under the radar is the political situation right now in Haiti. I mean, if you could imagine that it could deteriorate even more than it has over the past decade, it is fully falling apart. There are mass protests like every day out in the street, and this influx of white mercenaries. White special forces, white guys roaming around Haiti, indiscriminately killing people. And if you ask anyone on the street of Haiti, they will tell you it is 100%. This is Donald Trump. These are the policies. He is directly contributing to the suffering, of the people, the continued suffering of people of Haiti. And it's just kind of like, well, who cares if he gives this big sort of rhetoric about no more foreign wars? Tell that to some Haitian kid who gets his head blown off by some, white mercenary that Donald Trump has sent in there to protect, moneyed interests. It's just kind of, I don't know, the whole thing kind of, I'm so over this like facade of, I think it's all BS when it comes to him.
I think that there's something, I'm not particularly aware of what's happening in Haiti, incidentally, at the moment, and that's partly because of what you've said, which is that there's this gigantic distraction of Brexit in this country, which just covers all the news. And so even me, as someone who has co-written, albeit with Tim as the lead author, a book only less than 12 months ago, Union Jackboot. Regardless of that, I have not paid sufficient attention to foreign policy issues for about the last year, because it's hard to. But I would say that as something a bit more sort of, perhaps a more philosophical way of looking at it, I think there's something interesting about how populations read and understand the political world. And I think people do want to jump onto this idea that Trump is a peace president, or that he's going to, that he's fighting against the deep state and all those kind of things. They're because people prefer, generally, people in the conspiracy community, people who are tapping away online, people who are they're going to be more. People are excited by stories. People like to have myths. It's more enjoyable to have myths. It's more enjoyable to think that Donald Trump is doing something amazing that is kind of heroic and intriguing, and that's standing up to some kind of hidden force, because that's the way that human beings' minds are wired, and particularly when in democracies that are kind of hollowed out democracies, sort of hopeless democracies, where no one really trusts their leaders anymore, particularly since austerity, in your country, the crash of 2007-8, and the foreign wars and all this. It leads to this thing where this rise of conspiracy culture means that people are latching on to narratives, even when they make no sense, and so it creates this this desire for a greater desire than ever for myth, which people like Donald Trump then feed into. And unfortunately, the only way to make a better world is to ditch myths and to have genuine, rational, authentic, caring, thought-through, thoughtful policies, ideas, consensual and cross people working together across borders, internationalization, so that there are peaceful, effective, targeted movements to make significant, well-planned, well-considered policy initiatives based on factual information. Now that is happening a bit. It's happening with things like Extinction Rebellion, for example, which are facing, trying to face down, some of the most severe threats to our whole environment, our whole way of living. But it is not being helped by your Donald Trumps, however much people might want that to work in their own sort of crazy little human minds. That ain't going to happen. The way forward is unfortunately the rational way. It's the boring way. It's the way that requires work and time and organisation. It's those little old ladies out on a street campaigning against nuclear arms, and there's only 10 people there, and they're in a church hall, and they're wet, and they're shaking a tin. Those are the people who are really caring as part of the street, the fundamental part of the street movement. And those people are, it's that mentality that will lead to a international society surviving, but it might not.
Yeah, no,
that went a bit bleak, didn't it?
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's true. I mean, it really, it's absolutely true. I mean, I don't know. I try to always tend to be a little bit, more optimistic, and I think that, like you said, I mean, there does seem to be a renewed sense of urgency when it comes to how much we're poisoning the environment, and this need to actually begin to address it. And I think that, that's good. I think there's also, again, we I'm sure you got this even amongst the Brexit, 24-hour news coverage. I mean, it was, if it wasn't that, it was the protests in Hong Kong. Now, I tend to have some, serious issues with, how that's unfolded, the perception in the Western media that these are, freedom fighters fighting for democracy, even though, they're taking money from Steve Bannon. They're using all sorts of, right-wing symbols like Pepe the Frog, and obviously cooperating with the West to a degree. But, you look elsewhere, the protests in Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia, Haiti, as I said, I mean, they're the corrupt, puppet in Haiti right now, Jovenel Moise, he's asking the U.S. to come and intervene again so that he can stay in power. You've got an entire country is now literally in Haiti out on the street saying this guy's got to go. I think there is that sort of what you're saying, that people power. I mean, there is some of that is left. I think you can't totally defeat it, and I know that it seems like in the face of so much, just like endless Brexit debates that maybe we've lost that. But I think it's still there. People are still.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I completely agree. I mean, this is why I think human society is in such a interesting and precarious position, because we're literally at a point where we could quite easily destroy organized means of existing and go back technologically and in terms of sort of human happiness. We could go back decades or hundreds or thousands of years. We could go back to a new dark age pretty easily. But at the same time, the opportunities to marshal technology and to dial back on the way that we're abusing fossil fuels and all that kind of thing, there are possibilities for that as well, which could lead to a really bright future. And I know this sounds rather narcissistic, perhaps, as a British person, but indulge me for a second. If Britain is a good test case of this at the moment, forget about the specifics of Brexit. But if we do turn to a Labour government and having a socialist party, genuine socialist party, in charge of Britain, with a significant green, environmentally friendly agenda, allied to in some way with the Green Party and allied with Extinction Rebellion and so on, then I think that would be quite a powerful symbol in the world. Just in the same way, albeit on a smaller scale, as if Bernie Sanders got in the United States. I mean, it wouldn't solve everything, but it would be quite a rallying cry for the environmental movement and for socialist ideas. And also it would be something that would prevent there from being such a clear demonization of the left as well, because assuming that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't go mad and try and round up every firstborn, it would lead to a normalization of that kind of policy, and hopefully it would be. It's the same thing about nuclear disarmament. Like, I mean, if Britain was to ditch its nuclear weapons, which are useless anyway, it would be. It's not actually going to make the world particularly safer, because Britain's not going to get nuked anyway and not going to use its nuclear weapons. But it would be a huge symbolic event if Britain did it. In the same way that Ukraine giving them up and South Africa giving them up was a significant symbolic event. So that kind of I mean, Britain was a couple of years ago they did various indices to determine which countries were the most powerful in terms of soft power, and the two most powerful were the United States and Britain. And I mean, I don't know quite whether you can trust those measurements, but I think if Britain did turn towards a more rational and kind of constructive and took an inspiring role in the world, I think it could lead to something really good for the environmental movement and the peace movement and all of that.
Oh, absolutely. The nuclear weapons, and that's such an easy one too. I mean, because it really is. I mean, what is the point?
So breaking news! I've just turned over. I was going to say this a couple of minutes ago.
Please.
But you were talking about Haiti at the time, and
right.
about how we're so distracted from foreign policy because of Brexit, and I was literally going to interrupt you during you talking about Haiti to say, "Oh, news has just come in." But I thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that to your show. I'm not going to do that to this society. I'm not going to humiliate myself in this regard. So I politely waited for you to explain this very interesting and important information about roaming death squads in another country, sponsored seemingly by the Trump administration. But I'm holding back here because there's breaking news, which is that there's been a huge victory of 438 votes to 20 no votes to back a 12th of December general election in Great Britain. And I think possibly the ticker tape on the silent news that I've been watching was a bit confusing or confused because it does have to be confirmed by the House of Lords. But I think that the House of Lords will be looking at it tomorrow, and I think that it's seen as a kind of done deal that they will allow that to happen. So I think we'll know for certain that it's going to be a 12th of December election on Wednesday, but it looks all signs are pointing towards that.
Well, there we go. And I would assume the House of Lords would they be kind of crazy to vote against it, right?
I think it would be weird. Yeah, it would be weird. The Labour Party tried to change the date of the election.
To earlier or later?
To like 3 days earlier, and I don't quite know why. That one's slightly gone by me. Anyway, but that's where we're at. As far as you guys are concerned, and I think probably as far as anyone is concerned in this country as well, we know that there's an election in the middle of December. For all Labour Party voters, the election is on the 12th of December. If you're voting for the Conservative Party, as my friend John Matthews often says, that you have to vote on the 13th of December. That's the 13th of December.
Oh, that's good. Well, Matt, as we're, again, like we said, it's so easy to get sucked back in to Brexit and to forget. I mean, this was something I wanted to touch on with you, and I mean, we'll do that here for the towards the end of the show. But what we were mentioning, like, for instance, like this focus on the environment, focus on other sort of crises that are happening. I mean, what specifically, let's say in the UK, where, as we said, the obsession with Brexit is so intense. What in the UK do you think people are missing? And let's start maybe just domestically. It's not as if Boris Johnson's government is doing nothing else other than Brexit. Obviously, they're meeting with people. They're passing laws, or they're trying to. They're certainly making deals. What domestically is going on that people are missing because the obsession of Brexit is sort of clouding their vision?
Well, I'm not quite sure how good my answer can be on that, because the first thing to say is that all parliamentary time has been devoted to Brexit. So actually, you talk about these things that, the government must be pushing through things or having votes on other things. Well, no, they're not. The government's been paralysed for years and has not been doing anything else. The government's not been doing anything else. But I suppose the thing I'd say, but I'm sorry, it's a bit of a kind of pedestrian point, but the point is that the cogs of business continue to turn, and those cogs are not necessarily very good for anybody, because what we really kind of need as societies is, in my view, I'll say it, is we need to address things like the arms trade, which continues very quietly to continue to be, Britain's in the top three biggest arms sellers in the world, and we need to address things like nuclear weapons is another one, but we also need to address climate change, and the transport infrastructure in this country is not good. A lot of experts think that there should be at least 2 or 3 million new homes that are built in this country because of the housing crisis and the disparity between rich and poor, and the inability to get on the housing ladder. So all those things continue even when the government isn't doing anything. So the government isn't actually passing any sneaky laws while people are not looking. It's the fact that the government isn't doing anything that allows business as usual to continue. And of course that suits a lot of people, or it suits the people who are running this country, because it's just business as usual and there's no scrutiny. But actually, if you think that I often feel I have to keep coming back to this with any political discussion, and I say it explicitly in the first book that I wrote. If you think that everything's okay, then it's fine. You just don't need to think about this anymore. It's only really if you think that the status quo needs to be changed that you actually need to engage. And I think that it's not really what the government's necessarily doing. It's also what the government's not doing. It's just simply the nature of society. It's the nature of inequality and harm that's caused through our country just doing its usual thing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that our country is always deliberately doing evil things. But what's happening with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. That's an interesting case where we had only a few months ago on the pages of Politico, we had the Defense Secretary, I think it was, say, by selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, we're able to act as a kind of peace, a voice of peace, to broker some kind of ceasefire in between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Right. By selling weapons, to our long-term
peace through strength, right?
Bin Laden loving head choppers in Saudi Arabia, we're able to create a more peaceful environment. This was the guy who was actually the final guy who was running against Boris Johnson. You know, so he could have become prime minister. Someone who was making this appalling argument. And one of the things that we pointed out, we wrote this piece. I'll just quickly outline this, but we decided about 6 months ago, me and a bunch of other media analysts. I don't know if you're aware of this, Piers, but we decided to write a piece for a mainstream publication. And we said, look, we want to write something that highlights all of the things that are not said in the mainstream press about British foreign policy. And they were like, "This, yeah, great. That sounds like a brilliant idea for an article." We wrote it with them. They did an amazing editorial job. And they even put, they put bombers on the front. We could see it all happening in real time. They put beautiful bombs going off, and they put this amazing headline, which was the Western media support state terror while millions die. Did you hear about this?
No.
Western media support state terror while millions die. It was an amazing piece. You've never seen anything like it. And then we got a call on the morning that it was due to go out. It was about 5 months ago, and the head editor had intervened, and it was just pulled. It was just pulled, and we worked on it for weeks after that, refuting every single tiny point that the head editor had come up with, which was all to do with Libya and Venezuela and Yemen and Syria and all of those kind of issues. Actually, Syria was one of the ones that came in late. That's a slightly different thing, because there's all sorts of debates about what's happened with Syria and the the chemical weapons thing and who fired all that. But that was not part of the debate with the editor. But in the end, they just dropped it. So literally, we had written a piece, a significant feature piece for a mainstream publication about media censorship, which was then ditched. I wouldn't call it censorship itself, because that's a slightly different thing, but it was ditched along those lines for reasons of explicitly political motivations of senior personnel at that publication. Anyway, one of the things that we did highlight in that was that the Defence Secretary had said about how great it is that Britain can influence peace by selling arms to Saudi Arabia, billions of pounds worth of arms to Saudi Arabia,
while millions are dying.
And while not literally millions in Yemen, but it is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and I think about 100,000 people have died over the past 4 or 5 years. And he also said, but by pursuing this strategy, then we're 4 years in, but there shouldn't be a fifth year. But where's that? What's happened there? Well, it's still rumbling on. There's no indication that conflict is going to be adequately resolved, let alone the country rebuilt, let alone the lives to be somehow fixed. This is just this kind of brutality of the British state and British Foreign Office. And I think that's one of the things that really surprised me about doing Union Jackboot with Tim. Tim is the sort of expert on British foreign policy, and I was kind of there as a interlocutor, someone who was a discussant with him to bring out his knowledge, which was very much more based on the kind of tedious documents that no one else bothers to read from the Foreign Office over the past few years. And so I was trying to bring that out of him in the series of transcribed interviews. But I think it led to I really quite like the book Union Jackboot that we did, because it led to a very sort of fiery and interesting set of information to come from Tim, and that's one of them. That discussion about what Britain does is operate militarily in many more countries than anyone previously knew. It's operating all over the world with small contingents of force, and often for on the wrong side, either acting with terrorist organisations like the Kosovo Liberation Army, which are running drugs and all, and extremely violent.
Organ trafficking.
Exactly. Or at other times supporting dictatorial regimes, but very often on the wrong side, morally.
Yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to find, many times the UK or the US has been on the right side.
Yeah, I mean, there are occasions. I mean, what I do in the book, and I know that you and I have discussed the book before, so I don't want to bang on about it too much, but that I do try to present the not just the devil's advocate position to Tim in the transcripts, but sort of my own genuine sense of being a British person, and thinking that there are inherently some good things about Britain. And Tim's a lot more scientific in that and cutting in that regard than I am. So I do sort of say, well, come on, we did do the right thing in World War II. Winston Churchill may have been a bit of a bully bastard, but at least he got the results at the right time. And there are examples of. I stayed for a few weeks in Belize years ago, and Britain's got that's a protectorate of Britain. So there are cases where, and it's a it's a really nice country, and it's not as horrendous as, say, Guatemala next door, where the United States had considerable influence. So there are variants of this. There is a scale of there are scales of abuse, scales of evil, and scales of intervention. And there are places like Sierra Leone and Belize that have good relationships with Britain, where Britain has done, whether you want to call it the good, the right thing or whatever, but Britain it's not as straightforward as just Britain always being the sort of evil country. But I don't think anyone who's, including your Jeremy Corbyn types and your Labour front bench and all that, I don't think any of those people, including all the the academics that I often ally with, Professor David Miller and the Glasgow Media Group and all those kind of people, and all the people that I wrote this article with, none of us think that simplistically about Britain. We don't think it's evil and all that kind of thing. We're just trying to point out some of the problems and this systematic things that need to be addressed. It's the same thing with Extinction Rebellion. There's that kind of there's that attitude from a lot of people on the right who are just very complacent about it, who are like, well, they're all hypocrites anyway because they're all flying around and they all go on holiday in planes, and it's like, and they just think that they're fine because that they're going out on the street, and actually all they're doing is holding up the traffic, and it's like, well, no one thinks that. I've never come across a protester, an anti-war protester, let alone an Extinction Rebellion protester, who doesn't think that they are part of the problem. It's just that they are also trying to be part of the solution.
That is such a simple yet profound statement there, and I think that if you go from that, the critical mentality there, that mindset, then what's the point of ever, not even just like going out on the street and protesting, what's the point of ever having an argument with someone about political, economic issue? And I think you're right. I mean, none of them are. Listen, all those people, out, marching climate change and all this stuff. I mean, they probably all own iPhones, yep. Not the most environmentally friendly device, but again, I have one too. You and I are talking on microphones and computers. I mean, none of that is environmentally or friendly, and it's certainly not friendly to the people that mine all of the minerals needed for this. But again, that doesn't mean that at that point, it's like, then why bother with anything? Why don't we just completely acquiesce to Big Brother, and we'll just we'll solve peace in the Middle East by selling weapons.
Exactly. You end up going right through the looking glass and saying this, and everything goes completely topsy turvy. I've often thought that the it's like, I don't particularly oppose free market systems. I don't particularly oppose capitalism. And I've said it before, and I'll say again, I just think that, instead of seeing the world, I'd prefer the world to be operating a little bit more like a jumble sale and a little bit less like an arms sale. I think that's, even if we just did that, even if we just addressed some basic reforms in workers' rights and the use of sweatshops, and even small reforms, even the banning of certain weapons, certain
white phosphorus is an easy one.
Exactly. It doesn't take much. All it requires is a bit of creative thinking, and just going a little way down that route would have huge impacts on beneficial impacts, preventing the suffering of some human being. It's all this basic stuff that you read in kids' books, that are, for 5-year-olds. It's like, I can't change everything for everyone, but whatever was that thing with throwing the fish back in the water? You can't save all the fish, little Jimmy, or whatever. It's like, well, I can save this fish. I mean, it's pathetic, really. But human beings kind of need to be reminded that it is worth. I think it's worth doing, even a small amount of good if you can. And if you're not doing that, you're basically either being a horrible human being, and you are fundamentally a horrible human being, or you're being avoidant. You are avoiding what your own emotions are telling you to do, which is to be a bit kinder.
Oh yeah, and I mean, we could analyze that at length. I mean, just to, we're avoiding all this stuff because again we're so consumed with our phones and social media and all these like meaningless things. We'll spend hours and hours. It's like I find it so funny when like Twitter or Instagram goes down. People literally freak out, lose their shit. Like, I can't get on Instagram, and it's like, who cares? It's like that. Like that's important to them. But again, trying to just stop the U.S. and other countries from selling white phosphorus to countries that are going to use it on civilian populations. That's a bridge too far. But we are. Oh no, I was going to say we're basically out of time, Matt. But the final word I will give to you in the last minute.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to say that I also think that although I agree with you about human beings being a bit shit on all of that, and that we do drop the ball, and that we are, obsessed with phones and the petty things in life, in the end, I still think it's on that sliding scale of responsibility. And actually, it is people in the Pentagon who are ultimately responsible for white phosphorus, for policies that are murderous. So, yeah, I can criticize myself and everyone and all of my friends and family and all that for not getting out on the street every day to protest white phosphorus, blah, 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 blah. But actually, we're not the ones who are selling it. We're not the ones who are using it. So, yeah, it is done in my name, and I have some responsibility for that. But it's the government that we should be looking to change, and there's only so much we can do on that. But I don't think we should give ourselves too much of a hard time.
Well, absolutely. One thing certainly listeners in the UK can do is go and vote on December 12th. And I would echo what Matt had said earlier and vote Labour if you want. Maybe if you vote Labour, we might be able to get rid of some of the white phosphorus out there. But I want to thank Matthew Alford for joining me. I highly recommend you go and check out his work, including Union Jackboot, What Your Media...